So unfortunately, I cannot be with you this afternoon. As I mentioned yesterday, all the teachers are involved in a PD. You are still learning this lesson, so I decided to go the March 2020 route where we recorded everything. And you watch the videos and you learn from that. So we're doing pedigrees. So pedigrees is a tool that we can use to show the relatedness, the inheritance from one generation to the next. On the screen, you'll currently see that I have listed parents, kids, and grandkids, but that's English. We use different, more specific terminology in science. So the parents is denoted by the letter P, the kids are denoted by F. F stands for filial generation. F1 is the first filial generation, F2 is the second filial generation. We use circles to represent females, we use squares to represent males. Now, remember that when I talked about this before, in genetics, when I mentioned males and females, I'm talking about biological males and biological females as designated by the XX and XY chromosome. Also recognizing there are some exceptions to the rule that there are a small, very small percentage of the population where there are XY females, and we talked about that. So that's not a part of our conversation here. We are focusing on XY being males and XX being females. That is our premise. When we use a pedigree, we're trying to demonstrate that something has a particular trait and how that trait is passed from one generation to the next. In this table here, I use the word affected, but it could just be trait. So let's say we're looking at black hair. I could say that the trait of interest is black hair. In this case, a solid square represents a male with black hair, or a solid circle represents a female with black hair. A hollow square and a hollow circle represent a male and a female without black hair, some other color. Right? So this could be the affected trait, or it could be the trait of interest. So as I look at this pedigree here, you'll see that I have a son, we'll call him, that has the trait, maybe black hair, and then a grandson over here that might have black hair. Or it could be male pattern baldness, or it could be ability to roll your tongue. In today's lesson, if you look at the calendar, you will see that I have, under pedigrees, a lesson plan for you. In this lesson plan, this is what I would have done if I were here with you. In the first link, it says pedigree collection. If you were to click on this, this is an activity where you can go home, get on the phone most likely, or FaceTime, and you are going to talk to your family members. And so there are certain traits. Anything about tasting we're not doing, because I didn't give you the special paper to taste. But there are many other traits that are genetically predisposed. There's a gene that causes this. And so if you look at your family, your mom and father, your grandparents, your uncles, aunts, cousins, nephews, as many as you can, you'll be able to make a pedigree that shows the presence of mid-digital hair or tongue rolling or earlobes. You can Google any of these pictures to see what it looks like. Okay? So that would have been the first activity, and that's just for fun. The second activity here is explore. And realistically, I'd probably save that to the end because it is something that you need to have the lesson explained to you, and then you can go back and explore this. So I might alter this order by the time you look at the lesson. Explain is what you're looking at now. Elaborate is something you probably won't get to, but it's for those of you who are trying to get the rich emphasis on the particular lesson of pedigrees. Okay. Down here, you'll see the note, and you'll see 1, 2, 3 practice pedigrees. These are practice. So you can print them out, or you can pull them up on your screen and you can fill them out to the best of your ability. So when I talk about doing the practice, I'm referring to this, this, and this. All right? The rest of this that talks about X-linked, normally I teach X-linked and pedigree on the same day. However, since I'm not with you, I'm only having you do pedigrees. All right. So coming back to the lesson here. If you have a person who is deceased in your pedigree, we draw a line through them, and that line indicates that they are no longer alive. All right? Occasionally, depending on the situation, we might not know if the person had the trait of interest or the disease. And if that's the case, we just put a question mark. All right? So now, let's jump into the pedigrees. There are three major types of pedigrees, and they're based on Mendelian genetics. The first one is a dominant pedigree. In a dominant pedigree, we use the filled-in square and circle to represent the fact that the person has a trait and it is a dominant trait. So if I were using hair color, for example, then this could either, if I use big B to represent black hair, which is a dominant trait, and small b to represent blonde hair, which is a recessive trait, then this genotype could be a big B and a big B, or it could be a big B and a small b. Either one of these could be the genotype for this male. Same with this female. When we start looking at a dominant pedigree, we don't actually care if it's a male or a female. That's not important. What's important is that it has a trait. If it has a trait, it's dominant. If it doesn't have a trait, it's recessive. So if I were to give you a square that looked like this, or a circle that looked like this is the one I can actually tell you the genotype definitely. I know the genotype is two small b's. If it was a big B, it would be filled in. Because it's not filled in, it must be homozygous recessive. All right? So this is known as a dominant pedigree. So let's see how this looks in practice. If you look at this pedigree, you'll see that anything that is filled in, purple, represents an individual with the trait. So we'll see that all throughout here, I'll just grab my highlighter, all throughout here, that we have quite a few individuals with traits. Now, when you're looking at dominant pedigree, so on a test situation, I would ask you to identify if the pedigree is dominant, recessive, or excellent. And the way you can tell it's dominant is that you'll see the trait here is in every generation. It's relatively common, so there's lots of purples. You'll also see that boys and girls are affected equally. Some particular pedigrees, it's mostly boys that are affected. In this case, boys and girls are affected equally. So this is a classic dominant pedigree. So now that you've seen what it looks like, let's give it a practice. Taking a look at this, I'm going to tell you it's a dominant pedigree. Based on this information, I would ask that you are able to tell me the genotypes of everybody. So let's continue with the hair motif here, and I'll use big B to represent black hair, and I'll use small b to represent blonde hair. So which of these numbers can you immediately ascertain? Well, I know that these three, 1, 3, and 4, have the trait, so they must have a big B. But I don't know exactly what the second letter must be. But 2, 5, and 6, because they are clear, they must be homozygous recessive. They do not have a trait. So these are easy to start with. Now that I have determined that this son here is homozygous recessive, I know that they got one B from their mom, and they had to have gotten the other B from their dad. So that tells me that this father must have a small b. I know they have a big B because they have the trait. So I've solved what number 1 is. For 3 and 4, I can also use the same logic but reversed. So if I take a look at this parent, I know that this parent only has small b's to give. So that means they must have given a small b to each of their children. That's all they can give. I also know that the other one must be a big B because they have the trait. So now I have solved what this pedigree looks like. All I gave you was shapes beginning, but based on our understanding that this is a dominant pedigree, I've been able to solve the genotypes of every single person on here. Now that we have seen how this works, your task is to work through this practice. You will see this on the course website. If I scroll down on the today's date and calendar to pedigree dominant, and I click on this, it'll open up a PDF document, and so you can work on that if you'd like. And as you work on that, you're solving all these numbers, 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 10 to 18. So you're going to use the same logic. In this case, big F stands for extra finger, small f stands for normal. Okay? So at this point, you want to pause the playing of this. You want to work through this. You'll also see in the website that I've provided you with answers, so you can double check to make sure that you've actually done this correctly. So if you go back to that course listing and you scroll down, it will say Pedigree Answers. So you click on that link and you can double check your work. Okay? So pause the video here and I'll just pause for 5 seconds while you're pausing. Hopefully you understand how to do dominant pedigrees. So next are recessive pedigrees. With recessive pedigrees, it is just like you would think. I hope you're thinking. Think about what a recessive pedigree would look like before you even read this lesson. All right, so as I take a look at this, anything that is solid has the trait of interest. And I'm telling you that it is a recessive pedigree. So that means the genotype of this must be 2 small b's. Again, it doesn't matter if you're male or female for this. When it doesn't matter, we say that the gene is carried on an autosome. Remember, our autosomes are chromosomes number 1 to 22. 23 represents the X and Y chromosomes. These are your sex chromosomes. Right? These 1 to 22 are our autosomes. If it's on the autosome, we don't care what the sex of the circle, square, it's irrelevant. These ones here that are clear, we don't know what they are, right? We just know that they must not be homozygous recessive. That means that these are either big B, or big B, small b. Homozygous dominant or heterozygous, we don't know. So in a recessive pedigree, the ones that you can answer easily are the ones that are filled in, which is different than the one that we just saw, the dominant pedigree. Now, looking at an example of this, here is a recessive pedigree. Notice how it's very different from the dominant pedigree. In the dominant pedigree, we saw that everything was, in every single generation, it was quite common. In a recessive pedigree, it's different. It's very uncommon. It still affects boys and girls equally, right? In this case, it doesn't have to because it's probability, right? But generally speaking, you'll see boys and girls affected equally. Sometimes the trait of interest will skip a generation. Notice that it's not here, right? It's absent in this generation, but suddenly it appears here. And it also is in this generation. But it's not uncommon in a pedigree like this, a recessive pedigree, for the trait to skip generations, right? So let's give this a try. Here is a recessive pedigree. So I'm telling you that information first, okay? Knowing this, which are the ones am I able to solve immediately? Well, I'm able to solve anything that has a trait. So I know that this and this must be homozygous recessive. Now I can logic everybody else out. I know that this had to inherit a small b from this parent, and they had to inherit a small b from this parent. So that tells me that this parent is going to be big B, small b, and this parent's going to be big B, small b. Must be. Has to be a big B because they don't have the trait. Now take a look at this one, number 4. Well, number 4, I know that there's a big B, but I'm not sure what the second letter is because they could have inherited either, if they got this big B from this parent, they could get a big B or a small b from this parent. I don't know. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the children. If I look at the children here, I'll see that this parent here only has small b's to give. So I know that they give a small b to every single child. Because none of these have the trait, I know that they must all be heterozygous. That means they all got a big B from this parent, number 4. So for number 4, I still have 2 choices. It could either be big B, or it could be big B, small b. If it were big B, small b, and I cross that with these 2 small b's that you see in number 3, if I run this through a Punnett square, I'd eventually find that, or expect that 50% of the children would be blonde and 50% would have black hair. But that's not the case. In this case, every single child has black hair. So that leads me to believe, not with 100% certainty, but most likely that this parent is homozygous dominant. Because if they're homozygous dominant crossed with a homozygous recessive, then this is likely to occur. Finally, number 6. Well, number 6, I know there's a big B, but I don't know this one. And there's no way for me to figure it out without doing a cross and seeing what their children look like. Okay, so I can't figure out number 6. 6 is unknown. So that is a recessive pedigree. So once again, in the course website, also on this document, you'll see a pedigree that's recessive in nature for brown teeth. Big N stands for normal, small n stands for brown teeth. So the only way you're going to have brown teeth as a genetic trait is if you have two small n's. Okay? So go ahead and take a moment to work through this. The answers are on the course in that same document where you saw the dominant answers. And I'm just going to count to 5 while you're working on this. You want to pause me one more time. And that brings us to X-linked recessive. All right, so this is a very special case. The last two pedigrees we looked at were autosomal. They're on chromosomes number 1 through 22. This next one is related to the X chromosome specifically. We know, because we've had this conversation, that biological males are XY and biological females are XX. What's very interesting about this is that when we take a look at the X and Y chromosome and you take a look at the human condition, we will see that every single person must have an X chromosome. If you do not have an X chromosome, you cannot exist. If you are a male, you have one X chromosome. It so happens that you have one X chromosome, every single person, and that you must have one X chromosome that's turned on. But you only ever have one X chromosome turned on. Now I'm simplifying it. The process is actually a little bit more complicated. But to simplify for grade 11, one X chromosome is always on. So with a male, because we only have one X chromosome, it's always on. So if this X chromosome happens to have a disease, then this son, this male here, is going to have that disease. So let's take a look at hemophilia. Hemophilia is a disease that's carried on the X chromosome. So if the X chromosome is defective, and we can represent it with this, that's a shorthand, it's a shortcut. Or I can represent it with a small h for hemophilia. So this tells me it's a recessive X. So this is hemophilia. So in this case, you have a genetic disorder where your blood doesn't clot properly. So if you get a cut, you bleed for a while. And this person here, this male, they would have hemophilia because they have only one X chromosome. This male here would not have not have hemophilia because they have a normal X. Take a look at the female. With a female always has two X's. But as I just mentioned at the beginning of this little XY talk, there's only one X chromosome that's ever active. So that means the female has a backup X. So if one of the X's is diseased or affected or something's wrong with it, then there's another X that will replace it. So this here would be a normal female. This here would be an affected female, so hemophilia. And this here, because this female has two X's and this one here doesn't work properly, it would be turned off. And this is the one that would be turned on. And so this female here, she would look normal. So phenotypically, she would look normal. She would not have the disease because the regular X is on. However, she does carry an affected X. So she's phenotypically normal, but she's also a carrier, which means she can pass on the X chromosome to her children. So this is the representation. So now let's take a look at the symbols that we'd use. The symbols that we'd use for a normal male looks like this. For an affected male, looks like this. For a normal female, for an affected female, and this one's a carrier female. So a carrier female does look like a normal female. So we'd represent the two. Sometimes you'll see a pedigree where they'll represent a carrier female with like a partial shade in. But for us, just using a phenotypic representation, that's fine. Okay, so these are the symbols. So this is different from the autosomal one that we just did a moment ago with the dominant recessive. In this one, the biological sex does matter. You must pay attention to the males and females. When you're dealing with this as well, look at this list. This list here shows you a whole bunch of different diseases that are carried on the X chromosome. There's many of them, right? I mentioned hemophilia. There's also color blindness is carried on the X chromosome, and all these. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but all of these are affected. And the list goes on, right? It's a pretty long list. And this is only a sampling. So that means all these diseases happen in males more frequently than females, right? Muscular dystrophy, red-green color blindness, and hemophilia are three of the most common ones. So it was fair for me on a test to ask you, why does X-linked problems occur more often in males than they do females? That's a fair question. So here is a pedigree representing a royal line. And royalty, one of the things they happen to do once in a day is they used to just have kids with themselves, right? They kept everything in the family, which is really, really bad. And we'll talk about this when we get to evolution. When you are keeping everything in the family, then mutations have a tendency to become more prevalent in that tribe. If you take a look at this, you'll notice that the incidence, which are solids, the incidence happens much more frequently in, well, males. Like, these are all males. So the problem is much more common in males. These circles here that are partial blue, partial purple, those are representing carriers. As I mentioned before, some of them will use special symbols to represent a carrier. But you'll see there's no affected females in here, because affected females are quite rare. All right? You'll also notice that the trait can skip generations as it goes from mom to son. Fathers never pass on the trait to their son, and males are much more commonly affected. So one of the things that happened once a time in history is King Henry VIII, he had many wives, and he chopped off their heads, right? That's the story. But what he was really upset that his wives didn't give him sons. And my question to you is, was that right? I mean, of course it was completely wrong, but who was at fault? Was it the wives, or was it King Henry VIII? Who is responsible for determining whether or not you have a son, the mother or the father? So let's take a look. Here is a son. A son is XY. Here is the mother. She is XX. Here is the father. He is XY. So, what does the mom give to the son? Well, she has to give it X. What does the father give to the son? Well, he must give a Y. It is the father's sperm that completely determines whether or not you'll have a boy or a girl. Okay, a biological male or a biological female, an XX or an XY. It's this Y chromosome that makes the difference. So the father gives a Y, you have a biological male. If the father gives an X, you have a biological female. Right? So, King Henry VIII was completely incorrect in his assumption about who was responsible for all the girls he always had. So if I take a look at my X-linked, there's also a thing called an X-linked dominant pedigree. These are very rare, but in an X-linked pedigree, if you have one affected X, then it doesn't matter. We're not gonna do dominant pedigrees, and I'm not there to go over it with you, so let's just skip this slide. There are some interesting animals where they exhibit, it's a mutation, where they exhibit both female and male biological sexes. So this is called gynandromorphism, and you'll see this all throughout the animal world. So you take a look at the screen here, you'll see on many animals, the male and female look different. They have different plumage, different coloration, different size, and all those sorts of things. So here you see a butterfly, a chicken, a lobster, and a type of grasshopper that all have this gynandromorphism, where it has both the male and the female somehow genes inside of them. Okay, so it's very, very interesting. And I have a link here for you guys to check out if you want to learn more about it. So in this case, I have a pedigree. I'm telling you that this is an X-linked pedigree. So what can we solve first? Well, let's first of all identify what my possibilities are. I know that my males are either affected or normal. So those are really easy to determine. I know that an affected female must have 2 affected X. I don't know this one. So this is one I'm always going to leave to the end. So I don't know if they're normal or a carrier. So now I come to this pedigree and I want to solve it. So I'd solve the boys first. They're easy, right? So I know that this must be normal XY. This must be affected XY. You can't read that. Let me go red. Affected XY. This must be affected XY. Normal XY. So those are easy. This affected female is also easy. Right? So now I have to logic the rest. I know that this son here, that they must have received their Y chromosome from their father. That means they got this affected X chromosome from their mother. So I know this mom has an affected X, and she must be a carrier because she appears normal. If I take a look at this number 4, well, I know that this daughter received an affected X from her dad, and she must have received the other affected X from mom. So once again, this must be, okay. Number 10, I know there's at least one normal X, and they got this normal X from, I guess, mom. Why? Well, because dad had to have given his X to this daughter. And so since he has an affected X, I know that, okay? So this is your information. This is what helps you solve these pedigrees. You have a dominant, you have recessive, and you have excellent. Last question I'm going to ask you before I sign off here. If you're a son and you want to determine if you're going to go bald, who do you look at, right? So let's say that balding is an X, right? So this is the son. And he wants to figure out who to look at. Most people assume that you look at your dad. But if you take a look at this pedigree, what did this son inherit from his dad? He inherited a Y. So the dad has nothing to do with it. He got the balding gene from his mom. Okay? So mom gave son the balding gene. So if you want to determine as a son whether or not you might go balding, you don't look at your father, you look at your mother's father, right? So when I go up here, further along the line here, this X, it could come from her father. He could have passed it on to his daughter, your mom, and then she could have passed it on to you if you're concerned about this. So when you're trying to determine if you're balding or if you have any other X carried defect or modified gene or malfunctioning gene, you take a look at mom, that's where you got it from, the son, and then you take a look at your maternal grandparents, your maternal grandfather. Okay, so that's your information. This final pedigree is your work for the X-linked. You can work through this. Now, I've given you this flowchart to help you analyze the pedigrees so you can solve them. Because on a test, what I would do is I'd just give you a blank pedigree. And I wouldn't tell you if it's X-linked or if it's dominant or if it's recessive. And then you have to determine which it is based on your understanding of pedigrees. Okay? So that's the pedigrees. Hopefully you got a chance to work through the pedigree at the same time as I was teaching it. And if you did, fantastic. If you don't, then you want to work on them now. For the remainder of the period after this, you can do whatever is assigned for the REBOP or for the genetic technology presentation. Tomorrow, I will continue with X-linked problems.